In the blood-soaked annals of Tudor history, where wives vanished into prisons, scaffolds, or shallow graves, one tale stands apart, not for its violence, but for the cruelty of survival. Anne of Cleves came to England not as a lover, nor as a queen with ambitions of power, but as a living treaty, a breathing alliance. Her crime was not treason or betrayal, but something far more dangerous in the eyes of Henry VIII. She failed to ignite his desire. And in a court where a king's vanity shaped a nation's fate, that failure would prove catastrophic. The year was 1539, a turning point in Henry's turbulent reign. England, freshly severed from the Pope's authority, stood perilously alone. Across the Channel, the Catholic powers, the Holy Roman Empire under Charles V, and France under Francis I had reconciled their differences. Their united front cast a long shadow over Henry's fragile kingdom. Should they choose to act, England could be crushed between them like a bone in a vice. For the king, marriage was no longer a matter of passion, but of survival. Enter Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, a man of ruthless pragmatism. To him, the solution was clear. Ally with the Protestant states of Germany. And the surest way to bind that alliance was through matrimony. The chosen bride was Anne of Cleves, sister to Duke Wilhelm, a respected figure among Lutheran princes. She was not just a woman, but a political lifeline, a shield against Catholic vengeance. For Cromwell, the arrangement was a masterstroke of diplomacy. For Henry, it was a gamble with his pride. By then, in his late 40s, the once glorious king had outlived 2 wives, disgraced another, and beheaded 1 more. His throne seemed secure, but his body was failing. The athletic prince who had jousted in gilded armor and dazzled the courts of Europe with his vigor now lumbered under the weight of age, injury, and disease. Yet his ego remained untouched. Henry still craved the image of himself as God's anointed lion, desired and invincible. The marriage to Anne of Cleves, though born of necessity, would also need to flatter his sense of virility, or it would never survive. As negotiations pressed on, the court buzzed with anticipation. Ambassadors spoke of Anne's dignity and chastity, her suitability as a Protestant queen. Whispers of her appearance were carefully curated, painting her as modest yet comely, graceful yet unassuming, the perfect counterbalance to Henry's domineering presence. To England, she represented not only a bridge to German allies, but also a chance to prove that its Reformation could stand firm against Catholic Europe. To Anne herself, raised in the strict and formal court of Cleves, it was the fulfillment of duty, a chance to rise as queen of one of Europe's most tempestuous kingdoms. But beneath the pageantry of diplomacy lay a more unsettling truth. This was no ordinary union. It was a collision course, a contract in which one man's decaying body and fragile vanity would soon unravel the ambitions of empires. Henry VIII's court still echoed with stories of his youth, the dazzling prince, who could outjoust any rival, compose love songs with ease, and move with the grace of a god upon horseback. But by the late 1530s, that golden image was gone, replaced by something grotesque. The king was now a man of immense girth, his once chiseled frame swollen into a mountain of flesh. His skin sagged, his breath came in labored gasps, and worst of all, his legs bore ulcers that refused to heal. They oozed pus and blood, filling his chambers with a stench so foul that courtiers resorted to perfumed cloths just to endure an audience with their sovereign. To the outside world, Henry was still the powerful monarch who had defied Rome and remade the English church in his own image. But behind the gilded doors of Whitehall, he was a man rotting from within. His ulcers were so painful that he could scarcely walk without mechanical aids, and his moods, once merely tempestuous, now veered into dangerous unpredictability. Every decision, every outburst, carried the shadow of his physical torment. His body, in decline, was at war with the myth of the mighty king he demanded his subjects still believe. Modern historians and medical experts suggest that Henry likely suffered from chronic osteomyelitis, an infection of the bone perhaps worsened by obesity and old jousting injuries. Such a condition would have caused fever, excruciating pain, and a constant reek of corruption. The medicine of the age could do nothing to treat the root cause. His physicians, terrified of telling the truth, bandaged the sores, lanced the wounds, and prescribed opiates that dulled his senses but clouded his judgment further. In this haze of pain and narcotics, Henry became less a ruler and more a storm unpredictable vengeful, and desperate for relief that never came. The decline of his body struck at the core of his self-image. This was a man who had built his identity on masculine vigor, on being England's virile lion. To admit weakness would have shattered not only his pride, but also the divine aura that cloaked his kingship. And so, when his body betrayed him, Henry chose a different path. He projected his failures onto others. His wives became scapegoats, condemned for what he himself could not accomplish. Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour all, in different ways, had borne the weight of his insecurities. Anne of Cleves would be no different. By the time marriage negotiations were complete, Henry's vanity and need for validation were consuming him. He wanted not just a wife, but proof that he was still desirable, still the golden prince of old. Anne, unseen but already mythologized through descriptions and portraits, became the canvas upon which Henry painted his last fantasy of himself. But reality, when it arrived, would prove far harsher than any dream. Before Anne of Cleves ever set foot in England, Henry had already fallen in love, or at least, with an image. Hans Holbein, the court's favored painter, had been dispatched to capture her likeness. His portrait revealed a young woman of calm dignity, dressed in the heavy German fashions of her homeland. Layered gowns, intricate embroidery, a stiff headdress framing a serene oval face. She did not smile. She was not coquettish. She appeared composed, modest, and proper, the very embodiment of a Protestant princess. To Henry, it was enough. The king studied the painting with a hunger born less of passion than of desperation. To him, Anne's calm face seemed to promise salvation, a dutiful queen, a fertile womb, a balm for his aching pride. The irony was cruel. Holbein's brush, renowned for its precision, had captured Anne faithfully. But Henry's imagination had filled in what the canvas never offered, a woman who would restore his dwindling vigor. He built castles of fantasy upon a flat panel of wood. In December 1539, Anne's entourage finally landed on English shores, bringing with them not only her dowry of tapestries and jewels, but also the fragile hopes of Protestant Europe. She was 24, untested in English court politics, but carefully prepared. She had practiced the language, studied customs, and even learned new dances to please her future husband. For Anne, raised in the disciplined atmosphere of Cleves, this was not a marriage of love. It was duty, survival, and a chance to become queen of one of Europe's most notorious kingdoms. The fateful first meeting was arranged at Rochester. Henry, ever fond of theatrical gestures, chose to disguise himself as a simple messenger. He imagined a scene of romance, straight out of chivalric tales. He would surprise Anne, reveal his identity, and watch her swoon at the glory of England's king. Instead, he found only polite confusion. Anne, trained in the strict etiquette of the German courts, did not recognize him, nor was she expected to. She greeted him with courtesy, but not passion. She did not fall into his arms, did not blush with awe at his presence. To Henry, who demanded adoration as naturally as air, this was not mere disappointment. It was humiliation. Witnesses noted the king's face darken, his jaw tighten. In that single moment, the illusion collapsed. Anne was no longer the idealized beauty of Holbein's brush, nor the fantasy bride of Henry's fevered mind. She was foreign, unfamiliar, and worst of all, unimpressed. The king who had broken with Rome could not endure being dismissed by a woman he had already claimed in his imagination. From that instant forward, Anne's fate was sealed. The marriage would proceed. Diplomatic necessity demanded it, but Henry's rejection had already begun. The wedding day of January 6, 1540, should have been a triumph of diplomacy. Westminster Abbey gleamed with banners and cloth of gold, the air thick with incense, and the murmurs of nobles who understood the weight of what was unfolding. England had gained its Protestant ally, and the eyes of Europe were watching. Yet beneath the pomp, tension crackled like a storm waiting to break. For the groom, already disgusted by his bride, the ceremony felt less like a union and more like a sentence. Henry VIII stood resplendent in robes embroidered with jewels, the very image of regal authority. But to those who knew him well, the disguise was transparent. His bulk strained against his garments, his legs swaddled in bandages beneath layers of silk. He leaned heavily on attendants, his face blotched and weary. Anne of Cleves, in contrast, wore her role with unshakable composure. Draped in magnificent Germanic attire, her expression betrayed no hint of fear or humiliation, only the calm dignity of a woman raised to serve duty before self. But the whispers had already begun. Courtiers fanned themselves with jeweled hands, their voices lowered but sharp. Some mocked Anne's German accent, others criticized her unfamiliar fashions. The king's obvious displeasure was contagious. Those who once had praised her now sought favor by echoing Henry's disdain. In Tudor England, loyalty shifted faster than the wind, and Anne was already losing ground. The true breaking point came not in the Abbey but in the chamber that followed. That night, the newlyweds shared their first bed. Or rather, they shared the space, for nothing else transpired. Henry later complained bitterly to his physicians and counselors, declaring that Anne repulsed him, that her body was unclean, that he had not been stirred to perform his husbandly duty. The irony was suffocating. His own festering ulcers, his bloated frame, his failing body all ignored in favor of blaming Anne for what he himself could no longer accomplish. In the twisted logic of Tudor politics, the king's impotence was transformed into his wife's fault. The whispers spread, first within the court, then across England. The new queen was undesirable, inadequate, unworthy. Every detail of her being, her manner, her clothing, even her scent, was scrutinized and mocked. What had begun as political theater now became public degradation. For Anne, the cruelty was swift and merciless. She had crossed seas, left her homeland, and placed her life in England's hands. Yet within days of her wedding, she was no longer celebrated as the bride of a mighty king, but pitied or ridiculed as the woman who had failed to please him. The alliance stood, but the marriage itself was already doomed. What followed in the months after the wedding was less a royal marriage, and more a spectacle of cruelty. The court of Henry VIII, already infamous for intrigue and betrayal, turned Anne's misfortune into a form of entertainment. Her accent became the butt of jokes whispered behind painted fans, her German fashions derided as clumsy and foreign. Even her perfumed spices and oils from the Rhineland were twisted into symbols of her supposed uncleanliness. The woman who had once been courted as a diplomatic jewel was now mocked as the Flanders mare. It was not only ridicule. There was method in the malice. Henry's courtiers understood that the surest path to his favor was to validate his disdain. To question the king's judgment, even silently, was dangerous. So they sharpened their words into knives. Every glance, every whisper, every smirk widened the chasm between Henry and his queen. Anne, who had arrived with dignity intact, now found herself trapped in a nest of vipers, where silence was her only defense. The humiliation did not stop with gossip. In perhaps the most demeaning turn, Henry ordered his physicians and attendants to examine Anne's body. Their task was not medical care, but confirmation evidence, however fabricated, that would support the king's claims of disgust. Ladies-in-waiting reported on her most private habits, while physicians probed and speculated, weaving reports that painted her as somehow defective. These documents, meant to serve Henry's narrative, would stain her reputation for centuries. Meanwhile, the contrast was paraded before her eyes. Henry had already turned his attention to Catherine Howard, a girl barely out of childhood, radiant with youth and pliability. In her, the king saw not just beauty, but the reflection of his lost vigor. At court functions, Henry's mood would brighten the moment Catherine entered the room, while Anne was left standing like a ghost beside him, present yet invisible. The cruelty was deliberate. Henry wanted everyone, most of all Anne, to see the replacement waiting in the wings. Europe watched with a mixture of horror and amusement. In France, courtiers staged plays mocking the English king's inability to bed his bride. In Spain, diplomats whispered that England's throne was now vulnerable, its king both diseased and dishonored. For the German princes, the insult ran deeper. The rejection of Anne was not merely a personal slight but a political wound, threatening to unravel the Protestant alliance that had promised to shield England from Catholic wrath. For Anne's survival became a matter of endurance. Each day demanded composure against mounting cruelty, each night a vigil of uncertainty. She had entered England as a princess, but now she was reduced to an object lesson, a warning that in Henry's court, dignity could be stripped as easily as a crown. By spring of 1540, Anne's marriage existed only on parchment. In reality, Henry had already abandoned her. The queen slept alone, her royal duties shrinking to hollow ceremony, while whispers of annulment thickened like storm clouds above her. For the king, the marriage had become not only a personal embarrassment, but a political liability. The alliance it represented was crumbling, His pride demanded escape, and once Henry VIII desired freedom, the machinery of destruction roared to life. The cruelest irony was that Thomas Cromwell, the very architect of Anne's marriage, was now ordered to dismantle it. Cromwell had gambled everything on the Cleves alliance, believing it would anchor England's Protestant future. But the king's disgust left him no choice but to engineer its undoing. He began searching the labyrinth of canon law for loopholes, while theologians were instructed to craft arguments that would justify dissolving the union. In practice, the verdict was already decided. The process was theater, a performance of legality masking the will of a king. Anne was trapped in an impossible position. To resist would be to challenge Henry's authority, a path that had led Catherine of Aragon to disgrace and Anne Boleyn to the scaffold. To comply meant surrendering her dignity. Yet she understood the stakes. She was a foreign princess, a stranger in England with no allies powerful enough to save her. Quietly, she chose the only path that offered survival: submission. When commissioners arrived to question her, Anne answered with meek agreement. She admitted the marriage had never been consummated, that she remained untouched. In exchange, she was promised safety, wealth, and a title unlike any before. She would be styled the king's sister, a position of honor that would secure her place in the hierarchy without threatening Henry's new ambitions. Estates, palaces, and income would be hers. Pride would be the price. On July 9, 1540, Parliament declared the marriage null and void. The official reasons were a tangle of convenient lies: that Anne had been pre-contracted to another, that Henry had never consummated the union, that she herself had agreed to its end. The truth that Henry had found her unsatisfying, and had already set his heart upon Catherine Howard, was left unspoken. That same day, Thomas Cromwell was led to the scaffold. The man who had built Henry's Protestant policy was executed as a traitor, sacrificed to cover the king's humiliation. Anne, meanwhile, was escorted to Richmond Palace, alive, wealthy, and free from Henry's bed. She had escaped with her head intact, a rare miracle in Tudor England. Yet survival came at the cost of public abasement, her name etched forever in history as the queen who was cast aside before she could even be a wife. Anne of Cleves should have vanished into the shadows of disgrace. She had been rejected by her husband, humiliated before Europe, and used as the excuse for the fall of Thomas Cromwell. Yet in a kingdom where queens were more often discarded through death than annulment, Anne's story took a different turn. Stripped of her crown, she stepped into an unexpected role: the king's sister, a title invented for her, and with it came estates, a generous income, and, most astonishingly, freedom. While Catherine Howard, barely more than a child, was paraded before Henry as the embodiment of youth and desire, Anne retreated to Richmond Palace. There, beyond the suffocating gaze of court politics, she began to rebuild herself. What seemed at first like exile became a kind of liberation. For unlike Henry's other wives, she no longer bore the daily terror of his temper, or the looming threat of the scaffold. Anne proved more than a passive survivor. She embraced her new autonomy, managing her estates with a shrewdness that surprised even her detractors. Records of her account books reveal a woman who negotiated favorable leases, invested in agricultural improvements, and transformed her properties into thriving enterprises. Her revenues exceeded Henry's initial settlement, making her one of the wealthiest women in England. In a world where women were rarely permitted financial independence, Anne wielded hers with quiet brilliance. Her position also allowed her to cultivate networks outside the dangerous sphere of Henry's court. German merchants, sympathetic to her treatment, offered her favorable terms in trade. She supported Protestant scholars and artists, turning her household into a quiet refuge for reformist voices. Nobles who distrusted Henry's volatility sought her company, finding in her a figure of dignity untouched by the king's paranoia. She had no official power, yet her influence was felt in the undercurrents of English society. Meanwhile, the irony grew sharper with every passing year. Henry's new queen, Catherine Howard, soon fell victim to the same cycle of suspicion and cruelty that had destroyed her predecessors. Within 18 months, she was accused of adultery and led to the block, her head falling on Tower Green. Anne, the humiliated foreigner, endured. She watched as queens came and went, as the king grew fatter, sicker, and more feared. Her survival was not luck alone, it was the result of a careful balance, visible enough to honor her role, invisible enough to avoid becoming a threat. By mastering this delicate art, Anne achieved what none of Henry's other wives could. She outlasted him, not by fighting, but by adapting, carving a life of independence and quiet power out of rejection itself. When Henry VIII died in 1547, the court was littered with ghosts of wives past Catherine of Aragon, exiled to death in loneliness, Anne Boleyn executed, Jane Seymour dead in childbirth, Catherine Howard decapitated, and Catherine Parr left to outlive him only briefly. Only Anne of Cleves remained, the discarded queen who had endured humiliation but avoided destruction. By choosing life over defiance, she had done what none of Henry's other wives could. She outlasted the tyrant. In the years that followed, Anne's place in England became quietly remarkable. She maintained cordial relations with Henry's children, especially Mary Tudor, whose Catholicism did not prevent her from valuing Anne's counsel on matters involving German states. She attended court festivities when summoned, her presence a reminder of Henry's failed marriage, but also of her unshaken dignity. Foreign diplomats who once pitied her now spoke of her as a woman of resilience, respected even if not powerful. Her private life flourished in ways most Tudor women could only dream of. At her estates of Richmond and Chelsea, Anne cultivated gardens, funded schools and churches, and presided over households that blended English and German traditions. She dressed with taste that fused continental elegance and English fashion, embodying the bridge she was once meant to represent. Her patronage extended to Protestant writers and artists, though she wielded her influence with discretion, careful never to cross the dangerous lines of politics. Perhaps most striking was how she was remembered by those who knew her. While Henry's memory curdled into whispers of cruelty and decay, Anne was regarded as generous, intelligent, and kind. She earned the loyalty of her servants and the admiration of neighbors, who saw in her not the failed queen mocked by propaganda, but a gracious lady of learning and charity. In her quiet way, she had rewritten her story, not as the bride who disgusted a king, but as the woman who triumphed through survival. In July 1557, Anne of Cleves died peacefully at Chelsea Manor. She was 51 years old, having outlived Henry by a decade. Her funeral, though not queenly in splendor, was held at Westminster Abbey, a final vindication, granting her rest among kings and queens. She was the only one of Henry's wives to be buried there, an honor denied even to women who had borne him children. History has long repeated Henry's cruel judgment, branding her plain, unwanted, and forgettable. But the truth is far richer. Anne of Cleves was not destroyed by Henry's whims. She bent, endured, and in the end, prevailed. She transformed humiliation into independence, rejection into resilience. And as centuries passed, the real stench of Tudor England was revealed not in Anne's supposed inadequacy, but in the rotting body and corrupted soul of the king who scorned her. Her legacy endures as a quiet but profound lesson. Sometimes the greatest victory is not in defiance, but in survival.